Hi, I'm Cynthia Sears. This is another edition of Open Book Tours, and our special guest today is one of the great promoters and protectors of book art, artist books, and actually books in general. She is the librarian of the Collins Memorial Library at the University of Puget Sound and is one of our major champions as well as authorities. And I'm not going to take up any more time. Here she is, Jane Carlin.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. And I am so happy to be here. I want to extend appreciation to Amy and to Cynthia and the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. I don't think that any of us in this room need to be told how lucky we are to have this facility in the Pacific Northwest. When I tell my colleagues in other universities who collect artist books, well, we have a museum with an artist book gallery, they can't believe it. So this is truly, truly wonderful. It's a really unique and special treasure for the Northwest. Let me tell you a little bit about what I plan to cover. A lot in 45 minutes or so. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to collect artist books and my background. I'd like to tell you about some resources for exploring book arts. I know many of you are practicing artists, but there's a wide wealth of literature about books on books that I thought might be of value to you. I'd like to tell you what we collect at the University of Puget Sound and how we integrate artist books into our curriculum. And then, of course, we'll have a show and tell. I'll try not to monologue too much. So, a confession, I guess Cynthia's already told you, I am not a book artist, but I am an advocate of the book arts. And I'm a librarian, and I've been a librarian for 30 years. It's kind of scary when you get to that part of your career where you're thinking how long you've been a librarian. But I've always been interested in the relationship between text and image. I was trained as an art historian and anthropologist, and I've always worked in art and special collections libraries until I took the position at the University of Puget Sound, where I'm now more of a library administrator. But what's been so wonderful about that particular position is that I've been able to meet all these wonderful book artists and connect with the community, so it's just been a really special experience. I studied in Great Britain for some time, where I had the marvelous opportunity to have a tutor named Dorothy Harrop, who was a leading authority on the Gregennog press, and that's a small press in Wales known for very fine bindings. And Dorothy helped me with my thesis, which was a history of the illustrated printed art book. Having trained as an art historian, it's always been interesting to me how an image can influence your thought process and how the image on the page in its interaction with the text can really change the way you perceive an art object or feel. So that's really where I came to artist books. And while I was in Great Britain, I had this wonderful opportunity to have an office at the University of Wales and one in Oxford, in the, not the university, but my husband's company, Blackwell's. And I was very fortunate to meet my husband in Great Britain. And just a sidebar, we say we're one-dimensional. I am a librarian, he's a bookseller, and on weekends, what do? We go to bookshops. So I thought it might be fun just to talk about my journey, to begin with talking about how many of the early book artists that we think of were influenced. And I think it's always fun to look at something from many years ago. This is a small fragment from a book of hours from France, a prayer book dated 1420. Right, and many of the early book artists, and particularly those in Great Britain, the great William Morris, were very influenced by manuscripts and calligraphy and illumination. I'll pass this around. We've used this with students in the 5th grade and middle schools in Tacoma, and I asked them before I show it, think of the oldest thing you can possibly imagine in your life. And they kind of ponder. And then eventually they say their grandparents. And then I pull this out. But it's a really great opportunity for students to see how 500 years ago artists were combining text and image. And as I said, I was very influenced by William Morris. I don't have any Kelmscott Press books to show you, but of course our wonderful collection at the University of Washington has a fantastic collection of William Morris books. But I do have a picture of William Morris. And William Morris was really significant because the establishment of the Kelmscott Press really led to the modern fine press movement, not only in Great Britain, but in this country as well. And I have a little book here that you can kind of thumb through that gives you some idea of the images. And you can see from the early books of the Kelmscott Press and the Doves Press, some small presses here in the United States, how influenced Morris was by the manuscript. And this pulled over into the reproduction of illustrated books for architecture and for design. This is a work from an early illustrated architecture book from the United States, about 1909. I go to flea markets, I find old books, I save the pages, and we use them in class. But I think you can, again, see the decorative motif. And I've always been drawn to books that are very decorative. That's my own personal interest. So while I was on my exploration of studying the history of books, I also started to look at how artists began to collaborate with printers and designers. And I was, again, very intrigued by many of the famous artists of the early 20th century, Picasso and Braque and Matisse, that worked with publishers to create illustrated, beautiful books, often called the Edition Deluxe or Livre des Artistes. And those are usually very large volumes. Again, we don't have any at the University of Puget Sound, but I know Sandra has quite a few over at the University of Washington. But that movement of having the artist and the publisher work together to create works of art was another thread in the development of art history and of artists' books. And eventually, as time went on, particularly after World War II, more and more artistic movements began to reflect upon the value of art and the preciousness of the art object. And many movements, such as the Futurist movement and Dadaism, sort of broke away from the preciousness of the art object, and many artists started to self-publish. Many artist groups started to create manifestos. And to a certain degree, some might say that was the birth of the modern artist's book that we have in this country. So there's really sort of three threads that I see going through with artist books movement in general. The influence of historical printing in the arts and crafts movement, building on the traditions of manuscripts in the Kelmscott Press, the relationship between early 20th century artists and publishers and creating beautiful editions, and then artists really taking control of their own work and creating manifestos. And many early modern artist books were often very plain. Is anybody familiar with the artist Edward Ruscha? So he has really great artist books. The names are like 26 gas stations on the Sunset Strip and 9 swimming pools. And these books were really simply photographic essays of images that showed the bleak urban landscape. And he was very instrumental in moving artist books into kind of more of a respected art history genre. And then, of course, we have today's modern artist book movement. And I found a quote from an art historian that I really loved, a British art historian named Angela Lorenz, and she said, "Artist books should come with a warning label. Once you know what they are, be warned, you will have the burden of trying to explain them to others." And I'm often finding myself explaining artist books to my faculty colleagues at the University of Puget Sound. Bringing the books into the curriculum is a passion of mine. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we collect at the University of Puget Sound. we look at books that reflect our values at the university, and we try to find books that represent local artists as well as issues associated with social justice, sustainability, environment, and personal narrative. As a private liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest, we are concerned about diversity and inclusion, and we also are concerned about sharing everyone's story. And too often in the history of many universities and colleges, not all voices are heard. And we feel that the artist book is a wonderful medium to encourage students to begin to tell their own story in narratives. So that's what we collect. We have about 250 books, which is, I think, a modest collection that's for teaching purposes. I thought I might tell you a little bit about some of the types of lessons that we do before we look at the books. I know some of you are educators, right, and work with students. This is a little zine. I don't know how many of you are interested in zines and comics, but graphic novels, zines, comics, these are very popular with our students today. So last year, I worked with a group of incoming students, freshmen, where we were in a room, not quite as beautiful as this room, but very similar setup with many artist books. And students worked in groups to look at books and to examine them and to react to them. And they wrote this little zine called What is a Book? And part of the discussion we had with them is we asked questions of our students, and I try to do this every time I see a new book, whether it's here in the gallery. I always think to myself, how would you describe this book to someone who can't see it? What do you see or read that makes you think? What message do you think the artist is trying to get across? List 3 ideas from this book that you can take back to the table. How do the format, images, and materials of the book help convey the message? Respond to the following prompt. Looking at this book, it made me think about. And how does this book make you feel about the topic? And one of my interests is to really make artist books approachable. I look around this room and see these beautiful, beautiful books, but sometimes they might be somewhat intimidating to a student who has never dealt with the subject. As a collector and a librarian, thank you all for providing wonderful colophons on your books and artist statements. Those are so important because we want to use those books in the classroom. We have also created a couple of guides, and I've made copies for you if any of you would like to take them back. This is a handout on using artist books to generate dialogue in and out of the classroom. And this is one of my favorite ways of using artist books, and I'd like to recognize my friend and colleague Malpina Chan. I think it was 2 years ago that we worked with Laura Russell on an exhibit dealing with books associated with the topic of social justice. And we have used books in our conversations at the University of Puget Sound and in community conversations to help foster discussions about difficult issues. Sometimes it's very hard for us to react to the political scene or to the issues associated with controversial topics such as gun control or freedom to marry whom you want or LGBT rights. And by using artist books in this way to generate discussion amongst people, it helps foster conversations and break down some of the barriers for talking. So today what I brought with me are many of the books in our collection that reflect social justice issues, and I thought that they would be interesting ones to show you. But before we go into those books, I also wanted to say that I have brought some books from our library collection on how to make books. So I don't know how many of you, are any of you like beginning book artists, or maybe some of these books are really, really useful.
Even if you're not a beginning book artist,
Right.
These are fabulous.
Thank you, MJ, because it's great. We all need inspiration. And so I just thought I would pass some of these around. Esther Smith is really wonderful, and some of you might have heard my story beforehand. I met her and her husband several years ago. They run a press in New York called the Purgatory Pie Press. I asked why it's called Purgatory, and it was because he dropped a big case of letterpress type and had to put it all back. And if any of you are typesetters, you know that takes a long time. Paul Johnson is a British art educator who makes incredible pop-up books and really unusual books. We use these in the classroom. And then I just have this is one of my favorite books. It's from the British Library. It's called The Art of the Book. But if any of you are in the classroom teaching or want that brief history, which I tried to give you in like 5 minutes or less, this is a great book that gives you an overview of all sorts of periods in illustrated book history. So these are just great resources for you. And then finally, I wanted to bring your attention to a couple of things. I know a lot of you are probably members of the Book Arts Guild based in Seattle. I don't know how many of you are members of the Guild of Bookworkers. Anybody a member of the Guild? The Guild of Bookworkers is having their national convention in Tacoma next October. The Guild tends to focus on very high-end binding. Binding is one of the major aspects of the Guild, but there's a Northwest chapter and there's a newsletter. So I happen to be a member, so I'm sending this around. Anybody familiar with Parenthesis? This is a British publication on fine printing and artist books. So this is another great resource. And we have these materials in our library at the University of Puget Sound. You can come and look at them at any time. And then finally, this isn't a periodical that's dedicated specifically to artist books, but Fine Books and Collecting. It's beautifully illustrated. I get so excited when it comes every month. And there's always articles on contemporary book designers and bookmakers. So these are just a few resources that might be of interest for you. So that's kind of the lesson plan. Now we get to go to the good stuff, the books. So as I said, I really look at artist books as a way to showcase ideas and concepts. And at Puget Sound, we really look to integrate our books into the curriculum. A good example is the first book I'm going to show you called Deeply Honored. I will try to be passing most of the books around. This I won't pass around, but you're all welcome to look through and handle it after my conversation. Deeply Honored is a book that recognizes and honors a young man that was affected by the Japanese internment. So I felt that this would be of interest to everyone here on Bainbridge Island because of our history and association with the internment. And I believe this weekend is our weekend of remembrance. At the University of Puget Sound, like many small colleges across the United States, and like at University of Washington, students were active in the curriculum and participating on campus one day and gone the next. And at the University of Puget Sound, we use our documents in letters. We have letters, very poignant letters that students wrote to the president of the university asking for help. They didn't want to be sent to the internment camps. And this, of course, to our generation of students now, they're really unfamiliar with that happening. This book honors a young man who was a student at the University of Washington, and he was able to receive the opportunity not to enter the internment camps right away, but to go to Carrollton College. And he then eventually enrolled, or not enrolled, but joined the armed forces and passed away, was killed in battle. And this book reflects his story. It's a very poignant book. One of the aspects that I think is so moving for me as a librarian is that Fred Hagstrom, the artist and printer, actually utilized the archives at Carrollton College and developed a relationship with the family of the young man. And as you turn the pages, you can read the letters and read his story. And it's very, very moving. And I think that the cover is also indicative of, really quite a poignant book. So I'll put this in the center of the room, and you'll have the opportunity to look at it once I finish. Sure. This is another book. Ann Tyler is an artist that focuses on very different difficult issues associated with social justice and primarily the African American experience in the United States. And this book is called Billy Rabbit, an American Adaptation. Billy Rabbit was a early English folk tale, a whimsical folk tale. And you're looking at this book, and I don't know what you see on the cover. Pitchfork, right. So this book is beautifully produced, beautiful paper, beautiful illustrations, letterpress, and it's interactive. So in order to experience the full power of this book, it's something that you have to sit down and read. But in a short kind of capsulated view, Billy Rabbit's story is adapted to be the story of a young man who is lynched. And as you read the book, you experience what is happening, and you have to pick up these instruments of torture in order to read the text. So it's quite a compelling and quite a difficult book to read, but it's very, very moving. On our campus about 2 years ago, we had some concerns voiced by students of underrepresented groups that they did not feel they were having a say in campus life. And we used this book along with a few other books in our collection to have roundtable discussions about race and privilege on our campus. And again, by using the book as the catalyst to start the conversation, it helps break down barriers. So this is a very moving book, a very intense book, but I think a really, really important book as well. And again, this is something that you're more than welcome to look through once we're finished. Another issue that we're very concerned about is equality and gender equality. And again, this is an issue that's very timely on our campus as well. And we have many student groups that are actively seeking rights for transgender students, and we want to have an open and welcoming community. So we have several books in our collection that focus on gender rights and the opportunity to explore matters associated with marriage rights. And this book is called Marriage Matters, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to, So basically the book is a story of many same-sex couples. The artist asked the couples to go to Sears Portrait Studio, and that's sort of an iconic American portrait studio, have their photographs taken, and then tell their story. So when you open up the page, you hear their story, but when you turn the page, there's also facts about marriage inequality. And when the book is actually set up in the round, does that resemble anything, possibly? A wedding cake. So this book is, students have really found this very reflective, and what I really appreciate about this book, and also Fred's book and Ann's, as a librarian, I'm always looking at ways to incorporate the research that students have done into the final product. And as a small liberal arts college, we have a great emphasis on writing and research papers. but maybe this shouldn't be taped. There are only so many research papers a student can write. And so it's really great to see the artist book be a vehicle for transforming all that research into a statement. So this has quite a detailed bibliography with it, which I love. So we'll pass that around. And on a similar matter, this is called Why You Can't Get Married. And of course, there's been several recent movies out on issues associated with biracial marriage. This book is a story of two couples, one a same-sex couple and one a biracial couple. And it shares photo documentation, photographs, stories about the struggles that they had overcoming bias in our country. And one aspect that I like about this book, and to a certain degree Marriage Matters, is the format. When I look around this gallery, I am in awe of the exquisite artistry of all of the books that are here. But sometimes our students, when they're first being introduced to a book, want a book that they can feel, perhaps I could relate to that. Maybe I could use my photographs, Photoshop. Maybe I could go to the campus copy center and get my book bound spirally. Maybe I can use those kinds of techniques to create my own image. So we try to have a variety of books that recognize all different formats and types of books. So this one is particularly moving to me. And then on the same theme, again, we're looking at, what does it mean to be a family in the United States in the 21st century? What are some of the concerns we have? And this book was a book that was in our Book Power show, Malpina, and it's called Mix and Match Families. And I think we actually gave it an award because we love the concept of this book that a family doesn't have to be a mother, father, and two children. Families come in all different shapes, sizes. And so the artist basically has created a flip book which allows you to create families of your own with words associated with belonging. And I've used this book with younger children, like middle school children that have come into the library, and they really like the interactive nature of it, and it allows them to think differently about their own family. We have many first-generation students that are coming into higher education now, students that are coming from families that maybe don't look like the traditional family. And so having a book like this is really great to demonstrate that aspect of our life. And then if I may, I'm going to switch topics a little bit. Not only do we have books that deal with social justice issues, such as we've discussed, but personal narrative is a really strong topic. And I look towards finding books that can tell the stories of the people that have made them. And this is a book by Malpina Chan, who happens to be here, called The Coaching Book. So Malpina, would you mind saying a few words about the book? I'll hold it.
Okay, I'd be happy to. So I was fortunate enough that my mother saved some letters and some immigration documents from my grandparents and my dad, who came over from China. And so I started working on a series, mainly prints, because I didn't know anything about artist books when I started. And so I have this series of prints that tell the story of my family's experience coming to America. And someone said to me, well, your work is so narrative. Have you ever thought of making an artist book? And I said, what's an artist book? This is going back a few years. And so I started doing research, which I love to do, and that led me to making artist books. And so this is one of, I think, like 7 in this series where I purchased this book, the blank book, because I wanted this long sheet of paper to print on. And I didn't know anything about making books at that time. So I saw this and I thought, oh, I could use this. So I had to print on it in sections because I use my printing press. And so I had to make it all the same level. So I worked on it in sections. And it's I think 60 inches long. And so I learned a lot during this process. And I don't work with an actual printing plate. I use a process called paper lithography. And so I use color Xeroxes and black and white Xeroxes. And then I use a solvent that works on the toner. And then you have to work really fast. So I treat the image, the Xerox copy, and then I run to my printer, and the plate's all set up and everything, and then I lay it down and then put my paper on top of it. So in working with this book, I had to make sure that everything was all the right height, and then I would turn it over and then run it through my press. And so anyway, so each one, even though I could probably duplicate my prints and my books, I don't have that litho plate, that copper plate. So I start from scratch every time I make a book. So it's kind of challenging. So I don't make big additions.
I really love this book, and I love to use it with Fred's book as well because it demonstrates the use of personal documents. And I think that artist books are also a wonderful way for all of us to tell the stories of our family, and this helps tell that story.
The calligraphy in this book is taken from letters that my grandpa wrote to my grandmother, because she was still in China and he was here in America. And so he wrote these letters coaching her, that's why it's called the coaching book, coaching her on what to say when she came to Angel Island, because the interrogation was pretty intense, and if you didn't have all your facts correct, then they would put you in detention, and sometimes it was solitary detention, months, sometimes years. And so you had to make sure that you had all your facts correct. Things like, what direction does your front door face, meaning your house in China? How many windows are on the west side of the house? How many stairs go up to the second floor? So the person that was over here in America, they would ask them all these questions, so they have these facts. And then the person that was coming over, they would interrogate them. And so that's what the coaching book is about. And he's telling her what to say when she comes over.
When was this? When was this happening?
In the 30s and 40s. I think there's there's one entry where it's 1939.
Thank you, Malpina. And Malpina's had a few books shown, I think, here in this gallery too.
Yes,
The
thank you
Evil
to
Eye.
Thank you to Cynthia.
And one of the few artists that I know that's made a glass book. But perhaps that could be another conversation.
Yes.
I wanted to share with you a book that I just bought. This is called Transforming Hate. And I don't mean for all of my books. We're going to end on a lighter note, let me tell you. But I think that it's important to demonstrate the variety of books that you can have that reflect difficult topics. And this is called Transforming Hate, and it's by a North Carolina artist named Clarissa Sly. And Clarissa's in her mid-70s now and has long been an artist and advocate for African American and women's rights. And Transforming Hate is the outgrowth of a recent installation in which she took white supremacist books and ripped them apart and made white origami birds, I think over 1,000, and installed them in galleries. And I'm very excited to say that at Puget Sound we wrote a grant and it was accepted, and she's going to be in residence at the University of Puget Sound in September. So hopefully she can make it to Bainbridge Island, but if not, hopefully you can make it to Tacoma. And this book is just really moving because you can go through it. And again, it's not a difficult format. This is another book that I feel is approachable for our students to look at and think, maybe I could transform my own ideas. She talks each page reflects upon an aspect of hate, and she has examples and photographs of the white supremacist books that she's torn apart and created the paper birds of peace. And of course, this is very timely, isn't it? So a book like this, we've had a lot of angst on campus recently with many of the political issues, and we have a student space called the Yellow House, which deals with multicultural and civic issues. And I'm planning an open forum and just having these books out for students to come and look at them, and we're really excited about that. So let me read a little bit about what Clarissa said. As an artist, I'm interested in history, memory, and stories as told by ordinary, everyday people. In this artist book, historical elements are used as a framing device to construct my personal narrative within our society's shared history of trauma. This journey began when I finally allowed myself to face the reality of white supremacist books. While working on the book's images and text, I imagined it as a dark and dramatic place. Finally, I accepted the fact that regardless of life's challenges, the place where I live is beautiful. The origami cranes that I've made from the pages of the white supremacist books are beautiful. So I had to allow this book to be beautiful too. So I think the whole idea of transforming hate is so powerful, and it's just so moving and so timely. And on the same message, and this is where I feel so proud of the artist book movement, many of you here in this room that are really taking social issues and using the book as an opportunity to make statements. Erase the Hate is another book that deals with very controversial topics. The format is very interactive, and again, this is something that our students find quite interesting. So the book is a series of small envelopes, and in each envelope is a little book that deals with topics associated with social issues, so gender, LGBT rights, gun control, racism, and you can take out each book and read the stories in Transforming Hate. Erase the Hate, Transforming Hate. Addresses bullying as well, which is another big issue. So all of these books can be used in the classroom and are very motivating and meaningful to our students. And finally, the last in the series of very difficult issue books that I'll show you, and then we'll move on to something that's on a slightly brighter note. This is called Anything Helps. I'm sure many of you know Laura Russell. Laura Russell is an artist in Portland, and she also runs the 23 Sandy Gallery, which is one of the major outlets for artist books on the West Coast. I might mention too, as a sidebar, I'm sure many of you know Bill and Vicki Stewart, who run a company called Vamp and Tramp. And sometimes I'm asked questions like, as a librarian, where do you get your artist books? So Bill and Vicki of Vamp and Tramp and Laura of 23 Sandy Gallery are great advocates coming to visit the library, doing trunk shows. But I often purchase books when artists call me up and say, can I come to the library and show you my books? And I want to see your books. So Laura is not only a gallery director, but also an artist. And this book's in the shape of a wallet. And Laura lives in Portland. So how many of you have been to Portland lately? Like many of, around the Seattle market, Portland has quite a large homeless population. And Laura was troubled by the signs that she would see on the street and the number of homeless. And so she created this book, which is in the shape of a wallet, and you can pull out each credit card, so to speak, and there are focus points about the homeless. And I believe that she worked with a group of homeless individuals and helped, she paid them to participate. She bought their signs. Right.
them.
So this is another book that I feel takes a social issue and transforms it into a way that's very meaningful, but also helps, break down barriers for when discussing it. Yeah. So any questions so far with the books that we've looked at, or any reaction to them? Do you think the questions that I gave you earlier about responding to the book, looking at this book, makes me think of how does this book make you feel about the topic? How would you describe this book? Do you feel like those are good questions and might be useful, even if you were having a discussion in the museum on social issues? You could use the books to break that conversation. And so I have these little flyers if you'd like. And we had guidelines. When we work with student groups, we often have to put guidelines in for what a group does and who has to be the facilitator and the leader. So that's that. So maybe go on.
This is your library
Yes.
mumble.
Yes.
Yes. Does this mean that this is in special reserve, or is
Okay,
it
that's a
for-
great question. So all of our artist books at the University of Puget Sound, just like at University of Washington, are located in our archives and special collections. And then we have a special location and a special room where we store the artist books. And we did not actively collect artist books until I took the job, and so many of the cataloging staff in the library were like, what do we do with these books? And they're complicated. So just from my point of view as a librarian, it's really wonderful when an artist gives you a book in a box. It's really nice. So in this particular case, we don't want the books marred with stamps, with barcode labels, with call number labels, but we need to identify the book. So one of the early ways of identifying was to put this acid-free strip around the book. Now we have acid-free tags that go in the book. But as a curator of artist books, and I don't have to tell Cynthia or Amy, they do present challenges in terms of space and storage, and that's something I have to look at too and think about, can I accommodate this book? Can I really take care of this book? But one of the aspects about our books is we really want them to be used, and we're a small liberal arts college with a focus on teaching and learning. We're not a research institution. We don't have graduate programs. So I do try to have books that students can feel comfortable holding and using. But yeah. So N7443 is librarian talk for the Library of Congress classification for artist books. I told a student the other day when she was pulling these books, I said, just go up to the N7433.4s. And she looked at me talking like that.
Yes, try that.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, and I invite all of you to think about this as well, in the Collins Library we have a large space called the Link. And every summer we have the Puget Sound Book Artists Association, which is primarily based of members in the South Sound, but we now have over 110 active members in our organization. And every summer we have our members exhibition. And if you're a member of our organization, no matter what your skill level is, you are entitled to have at least one book in our exhibition. And Malpina and I are both on the board of that organization. And I've been telling people for years, someday I'm going to submit a book, and you're going to have to put it in the exhibition.
And we will. Yeah.
But we're always looking for ways to focus the artist book collection. So Malpina and I worked on that one exhibit on social justice. And another member of Puget Sound Book Artists and a very wonderful and accomplished artist, Lucia Harrison, a year ago completed an exhibit called Dirt. And this show is documented on the university's website. And the show was really about all things related to dirt in our environment. including poetry as well as artist books. And this is an editioned book by Mary Gower, who I believe has shown in this gallery before. She is just an exquisite illustrator. And this book is called Burrowing, and it's all about the little insects that help make up our environment. So this is just a really, really lovely book. And I'll put that around. And she has the sealed test tube of dirt. I can tell you when Lucia approached me about the show, it was very troublesome, the title. But we didn't have any problems. But I really appreciate Mari's packaging of the book, and then her colophon is in this little pamphlet that's attached to the box, which is really great. So I'm going to pass that around. I'll pass it around this way for you to see. And then I'd like to just share with you some books of an artist that I just met, and I think you'll love them too, Cynthia. At the University of Puget Sound in December, we had the opportunity to benefit from a visiting artist named Diana Waymar. And Diana is now in Princeton, New Jersey, but she grew up in British Columbia. And she tells stories of growing up literally in the wild. She grew up in a home without electricity. I think she said her parents were sort of hippie dropouts. And from an early age, she learned to make things. So she was always making things. And she makes books, and she also does mini stitching and fabric type books. And this is a book that I love. It's called Lisa Loves Snow Globes. Someday She Will Travel the World. And one aspect of her work is very engaged with memories and with family connections. And this is a fabric book that's made out of her grandparents' beautiful linen that she dipped in beeswax. And she has stitched her daughter's Barbie doll and doll clothing on it. And she says it a lot better than I can, so I'm going to read what she says. To make this book, I soaked my grandparents' bed sheets in hot beeswax, ironed off excess wax, and created pages. Stitched the doll clothing to the pages, leaving a stitched imprint on the back side. This piece is very sentimental. It's an attempt to scrapbook the past, Lisa's childhood, and her eventual departure. The title is because she is brave, adventurous, and curious about the world. The time of playing with dolls is long past, and I think of this as a kind of memorial to that time. I want to tell the story of what is left behind in order to go forward. The clothing is flattened like dried flowers in a book. It leaves an imprint, like a hand, just as our memories imprint who we become. The book does not close properly because the clothing bulges, but the past cannot be closed properly. It always protrudes. And then I love this. She wrote to me, care. This book is meant to be handled. Just as doll cloths were played with, this book is joyful and playful. It should, on some level, stop us from taking ourselves too seriously. Diana is involved in a project at Puget Sound where we're doing a public stitching project, and she created 25 pages out of linen. And we are all contributing a stitched page, and then eventually the pages will come together, and we'll either bind them or perhaps put them in a box with a stitched cover. This is another work of hers, and it's called Testament. And this is very different work. She was reluctant to sell this. And I think for those of you that are artists that make a single book, it must be so hard to part with it. But I convinced her that we would take care of it. And this is called Testament. She inherited her grandparents' Bible. And she decided that she wanted to think about how she could connect the Bible with her current day life. This was an object, and I'll read it again. It was an object that I grew up with, and my grandmother did not leave any documentation with it. Without knowing how and why it was important to them, or could be to me, I decided to rewrite it with thread to infuse it with meaning and value to me. I am adding words to words. The original text is very challenging, and so what she did is that she created stitching in areas of the Bible that were meaningful to her. The stitched text was selected for very personal reasons. Each fragment or piece offers spiritual respite from the challenges of everyday life. And I'll pass this around. She has many of the stitched text lines outlined. I would ask you to be very careful with this. She also talked to us about the process of stitching the brittle pages and how that was sort of cathartic and also symbolic, because this is very old. The paper is very acidic, and weaving the stitches through. Many artists today are interested in using or reusing books in ways, and I think that this is a really fascinating example. So I'm going to pass this paper around. So those are two books of Diana, and I'm very excited, and she was a delightful woman to know.
Impressed that it's in the collection.
I know. I was happy. And then I think we're getting close to time, so there are a couple things. I'm going to end on a very high note, humorous note, but I wanted to show you a few things. I know a lot of you are interested in papers, aren't you? And that's a whole different topic, and there are many handmade paper makers in the area, and that would be a great topic of conversation. Are any of you familiar with the Dard Hunter Society? Well, Dard Hunter was sort of the father of American papermaking, and he grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio, and he made fine papers, and there's a lot of information on them, but there's a society that meets every year. Two of our Puget Sound Book Artists members go to that, Deborah Greenwood and Lucia Harrison. But every year, the paper makers create a portfolio of handmade paper, and I recently was able to purchase this in a silent auction. So I not only love the paper that it comes in, but it's just so much fun to go through. It's just filled with all different types of handmade paper. So I'm not sure what we're going to do with this. Maybe someday we'll make books out of it or share it with students, but I thought you would enjoy seeing this. So I'll put it down. Yeah. And then finally, this is the last book I'm going to show you, and it's a treatise of the time. This is one of the most popular books with young adults that come into the library. And this book was, I think it was done in like 2007, so it's not too old, but 10 years. So, have you seen this one before? So it could go on my belt. It's a hoodie. So who wears hoodies nowadays? Everybody, kids. So I'm going to make you guess. So here we're taking it out of its hoodie. So what's this? Cell phone. And could anybody take a wild guess what this could be? This might be about. Good guess, but something a little bit more traditional that every high school student has to read. Has a hard time maybe reading because
The elements of style.
all good. It's Romeo and Juliet. This is the balcony scene in text messaging. So I just, when I saw this, I thought this is not only just a fun book to have, but also what a great introduction to say, like, we've had the actual English classes with Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare in the bound printed volume where they can't get through it. And then you have this, and it sort of helps students make that connection. And the artist's statement, the language in Shakespeare's plays has stood the test of time, but could it survive a translation into text messages by a modern teenager? I asked my 16-year-old granddaughter to rewrite the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet as if it had all happened between two teens text messaging on their cell phones. So I just thought that was great. And that's kind of ending on a high note. Yeah, so, and I guess I'll conclude my comments by saying thank you so much for being attentive. At the University of Puget Sound, we don't have a book arts program yet, but I'm determined to get one. We did rescue a small desktop printing press, and we sometimes print small broadsides. Last spring, our president retired, and Ron Thomas was a wonderful man who really supported archives and special collections and provided funding for us to create an archives and special collections space, which we just opened last week, or last month, and it's truly beautiful. And he also gave us his personal book collection, not of rare books, but books that changed his life. And I asked him to write an essay about why the books are important to him. And he titled it Literature is Everything, but I think it could be Artist Books Are Everything. So I'll end with reading this, and then you can all take home a broadside. So, literature is everything, or at least it has the capacity to appropriate everything about its time and to see beyond it, to allow us to imagine things we have never imagined, to consider the dangers and complexities in things we have taken for granted, to conceive of alternative worlds and ways of living and expressing ourselves, to tell new stories about ourselves and about what it all means. The eternal quest for newer world. This is what I see in the X-ray of the heart of my collection, but there is always so much more to see. And when I read this, I thought that could be an artist's book. Yeah. So thank you all so much, and happy to answer questions.